Hi, everybody. This is my first podcast on my YouTube channel and on whatever other source that you're getting it. So I expect this to be a little bit different if you've been watching my devotionals. Usually they're fairly fast-paced and a lot of things going on visually. This is going to be more like my Sunday school lessons that I've taught, or when I teach at retreats or seminars where it's more conversational and I'm just talking to you about what's on my mind. So today I'm talking about the biblical call to justice applied to 2020. What we're going to cover today is, first of all, the biblical definition of justice and its partner, righteousness. We're going to look at the key element of justice that we see in the Bible. Then how the Bible explains how to implement justice. And all throughout, I'll try to, at least indirectly or directly, make the point of how does this relate to what's going on today in some of the actions and attitudes and conversations that we're seeing in June of 2020. So the first thing is that justice and righteousness are often paired in the Bible. I'm talking about justice, but if you look at Bible verses, so often it's paired with righteousness. And that may not seem obvious when we think about our own definitions these days of justice and righteousness in kind of our modern terminology. So for justice, we often think about punishing a criminal or going through the criminal justice system, that sort of thing. But that's not really the biblical understanding of justice. And then there's righteousness, which sometimes has been converted over to being self-righteous. When we hear righteousness, we think of self-righteous, which has a negative connotation. So you can see right off that justice and righteousness have these connotations that are different today than the positive meanings they have in the Bible. So let's look at a few of the places in the Bible where you see justice and paired with righteousness, because this is not uncommon at all. First is in Amos, and this is one of the most famous passages about justice and righteousness that we have, popularized actually by Martin Luther King Jr. And the quote goes, "Let justice roll down as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream." And then in Proverbs 29, "The righteous care about justice for the poor, but the wicked have no such concern." Now, here's the theme that we're going to see quite a bit. Righteousness versus wickedness. The righteous people versus the wicked people. That's going to show up quite a bit in the Bible when we talk about this. Which side are you on is what you have to wonder as you read the passage. And then justice for the poor. Often it's called out very specifically. We're not just talking about justice, but justice for the poor. This is how we see in that last verse from Proverbs. Let's look at another one from Proverbs 21. "When justice is done, it brings joy to the righteous, but terror to evildoers." So in this case, if you're one of the righteous, you rejoice at the idea of justice. So it's righteous is better than being wicked, and justice is something that brings joy. So justice and righteousness, again, going together. If you find yourself afraid or even terrified of what justice might mean, you're kind of falling on the side of evildoers in the side of the Bible. Okay, Isaiah 28. "I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plumb line." So I'm not much of a carpenter, but I do know that a plumb line is what they use to center, to make things right, to have everything work off of that plumb line. So it's centered, it's justified, and that's the standard. So measuring line, plumb line, God is saying in this passage that justice and righteousness are the standard by which everything else works off of. That's an interesting thought. So let's talk, though, about God's justice and righteousness, because as we get into this, we sometimes see the Bible use justice in a little bit different way when it talks about God. In fact, Psalm 89 says, "Righteousness and justice are the foundation for your throne." God is the judge of humans, the loving but firm Father who mixes accountability and mercy. Ultimately, his judgment is wise and fair and true. And God is righteous, which means he's holy, he's perfect, he's blameless. This wisdom is part of his righteousness, and he's set apart. So that's how we see God. But humans, we're not quite the same way. But we have a task, we have a role in the Bible regarding justice and righteousness. We're not supposed to judge. We leave that to God. God's judgment is fair and true and wise. Our judgment is not so much, and judgment is left to God. We're not holy by the nature of our sin. So we still do have a purpose, and that's to try to implement the concepts of justice and righteousness here on earth. We see that over and over in the Bible. And justice for us is about administering fairness and equality, because it's about lifting the poor to join society. Let's look at Proverbs 18. It is not good to be partial to the wicked or to deprive the innocent of justice. And then Isaiah 10, woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing orphans. So justice is concerned with fairness toward those who are the most vulnerable, the oppressed, the innocent, those who are the weakest in society. And a lot of times you see a contrast between that and people who are rich and powerful, who are able to have the means and the influence to maybe bribe a judge. The Bible talks about not being partial. We see that in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament in the letter of James, where it talks about not being partial depending on someone's status in the world. So what is the definition of justice and righteousness? Well, justice, again, is just, fair. It's designed to lift the weaker members toward the rest of society to an equal standing, actually, with the powerful in society. That's the idea. And then righteousness is holiness, purity, as much as we can achieve it, but we're made holy and blameless through the lens of Christ, through the sacrifice of Christ. And hopefully we, in our behavior, can also be upright and do good deeds. All that is part of righteousness. So another way to look at it is justice is about making things right, and righteousness is about doing right by people. So let's look at one of the key elements of justice and righteousness. And there's a word that keeps cropping up in the Bible in relation to justice and righteousness, and that's mercy. In Micah 6, one of the most famous passages about mercy, he has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Act justly, implement justice with mercy for all, but especially, of course, for the downtrodden, but to live a life that's full of mercy and compassion. Matthew 9, this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees when they criticized him for eating with the tax collectors and the sinners. And he says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus is quoting from the prophet Hosea, but actually the prophet Amos has a similar theme. In fact, the passage we read earlier from Amos has 3 verses in front of it that are very interesting, that Martin Luther King Jr. focused on that last of the 4 verses, but the other 3 set it up. And here's what it says, starting in verse 21, chapter 5 of Amos. I despise your religious feasts. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. God doesn't want songs and sacrifice as much as he wants us to implement justice and righteousness. We in the church, we who are Christians, cannot separate this idea of worship and praise and going to God, and then the concept of being out in the world doing things that implement God's kingdom. God is saying they're connected, just as we see in other places where we're told, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, we get the frightening idea that if we don't forgive others, we're not going to be forgiven ourselves. And God is saying the same thing. Don't bring me all these songs and sacrifice until you've gone out in the world and done the things that I've asked you to do. Live like I've told you to do. Implement my kingdom here on earth. So he's asking for fairness, equality, holy living, making things right, and treating people right. Now, how does the Bible explain how to implement justice, if that's the thing that we're supposed to go to? So let's turn now to Zechariah 7 and work off of this section for a little bit. Starting in verse 9, this is what the Lord Almighty says: administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the alien or the poor. In your hearts, do not think evil of each other. Now, this has been described what has been called the quartet of the vulnerable: the widow, the orphan, the alien, and the poor. And in fact, it even goes on to talk about all of us by the end of it. In Jewish society, the widow and the orphan were especially vulnerable. They had no protection. They didn't have the same legal rights. Often they were doomed to a life of really being on the edge. The alien, the immigrant, this person lacked personal rights, lacked some of the protection. They may not have been well funded when they came in from another country. They're living on the edge. And of course, the poor lack in many areas. So, if you haven't already looked in the mirror during this podcast as you hear what the Bible has to say, now is a good time to do it, because we have to ask the question, have we administered justice? Have we done things, made things right, done things right for the most vulnerable in society? The vulnerable right now are telling us, no, you haven't. And I don't think that's really a surprise. We may be turning a deaf ear to it as in the past, but it doesn't mean that it's not so. So the other thing this passage goes on to do is talk about how to treat everybody. Do we think evil of each other? Are we suspicious of each other? Do we question motives and integrity and intellect of each other? Do we judge others based on their skin color or how they vote or what their opinion is? Do they do the same things that we do or not? We're very comfortable with people who are just like us. And that's not what the Bible is telling us to do. The Bible is saying reach out to those who are exactly different from who you are. So the Bible is calling us in these passages and today in 2020 to the humility and wisdom that's required to implement justice and righteousness in our world, in our society. We fail to do this. And it wouldn't surprise me if God is getting kind of fed up with the whole situation with us. Because let's continue reading now in Zechariah. Pick up where I left off and start in verse 11. But they refused to pay attention. Stubbornly, they turned their backs and stopped up their ears. They made their heart as hard as flint and would not listen to the law or to the words that the Lord Almighty had sent by His Spirit through the earlier prophets. So the Lord Almighty was very angry. So they're told to administer justice, and then they just keep going on in their same hard-hearted way. That's the challenge for us. Are we going to change? Are we going to turn the deaf ear? Are we going to turn our backs on what the Lord is telling us? Are we going to go forward and administer justice in the world? We may see the events of the past week as a political crisis or a legal crisis or a crisis of lawlessness. But I would submit to you what we're seeing is a crisis of the Spirit. It's a failure to follow the Bible and what it tells us to do. It's a failure to implement God's kingdom on earth, one of justice and righteousness. So where do we go from here? Well, I can't turn to the Bible without eventually getting around to Jesus. And Jesus has a couple of famous quotations that really help us here. Matthew 22, love your neighbor as yourself. And in Matthew 7, in the Sermon on the Mount, the golden rule, do to others what you would have them do to you. Now, there's a very simple way to implement these two concepts, and that's really putting yourself in the other person's shoes. How would I like to be treated if I were in their shoes? Would I like to be discriminated against because of my skin color? Would I like to be pulled over for no reason? Would I like to have insults hurled at me, to be sneered at? Would I like to get the silent treatment in some cases, to not feel like I'm part of the society? Do I prefer to have economic disadvantages, to have fewer educational opportunities, to have a poorer health profile because of my position in society? Would I like to be, to just extend it to even others, to be disconnected and depressed? Would I like it to be on the other end of that Facebook post I just wrote, or that Twitter blast that I did, or that Reddit comment that I made? Would I like to be on the other receiving end of that or not? Do unto others. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not just love your neighbor as yourself. Just the way you would like to be treated, the way you would like to be loved. That's what we're called to do. So, what are you doing? Are you starting with finger pointing? Is that what we do? Because a lot of times, I know my inclination is to look at other people and say, well, they are doing that. That's why I had to act that way, because they are doing that. Jesus isn't interested in they, not very much. He's always talking about you. What are you going to do? How are you going to behave? This is the kind of thing that we need to focus on, rather than saying, well, so I did this because they did that. No, you do this because it's just and right, and it's what God is asking you to do, and it's what Jesus is asking you to do. So are you doing justice? Are you living righteously? Are you being fair? Are you discriminatory? Are you trying to overturn the wrongs of the world? This is a big problem because, I'm not the president, I'm not the governor, I'm not the mayor. But each one of us is in some position in life to change things. It may be on your street. It may be responding to a comment at the grocery store. But it's something that you can do to change little by little. We are supposed to be the yeast of the kingdom of God, and to have that kind of flow through the bread and to change things. And that's what we need to do right now, is little by little. There's big ways, and we need to try to see that the big ways are handled. But even in little ways, we need to see how we can start to bring justice and righteousness and the kingdom of God here on earth. So let's repent as individuals and as a society. Let's not stop up our ears any longer. Let's listen to what the Bible says and go and administer true justice. Well, I want to tell you about what's coming up next in my cycles on my YouTube channel. I do devotionals on Tuesdays, and on Thursdays I do a podcast now. So the next event is coming up on Tuesday, June 9th, and I have a devotional called We Can Work It Out, which sounds very positive. It uses the Beatles lyrics. But when you really go and read those lyrics, you realize it's not such a positive message. And I'm going to talk about how we should use those lyrics to live our lives a little bit differently when we have disagreements and we try to work things out like this. So thanks for joining me for this. Subscribe to my YouTube channel now. You've got the button right there if you're watching on YouTube. And like my Facebook page. And please, let's work together to take our beliefs and the things that are in the Bible and turn them into a 7-day practical faith.